In West Africa, where politics often dances on the edge of fire, a regime long thought untouchable has finally crumbled. The world woke up stunned. At 3:12 a.m., military vehicles rolled through the streets of Abidjan. The presidential guard was overwhelmed in under an hour. By dawn, the flag flying above the palace was no longer the same. And just like that, another chapter in Africa's long war with dictatorship had turned its final page. But this wasn't just any coup. This was Ivory Coast, once the darling of post-colonial West Africa, a country the West praised for its stability, while quietly ignoring the creeping authoritarianism beneath. For more than a decade, President Alassane Ouattara had ruled with an iron grip camouflaged as democracy. For the elites, his regime brought profits. For the people, it brought fatigue, fear, and silence. Now, silence had turned to marching boots. Fatigue had turned into defiance. And the dictator had finally fallen. Ivory Coast military coup, the headlines screamed. Another dictator is down. But this wasn't just about one man. It was about how he got there, who protected him, and why the military finally said, no more. They say power corrupts, but in Ivory Coast, power also forgets how to leave. In 2010, Alassane Ouattara was hailed by international observers as a beacon of progress. An economist with a polished accent and elite connections, he emerged from the shadows of international banking to claim the Ivorian presidency. But behind that Western Polish lay the seeds of something far more dangerous: entitlement to rule. When his second term neared its end, the constitution said enough. But Ouattara had a different plan. In 2020, he made the move that would define his legacy. He ran for a third term. The justification? The new constitution of 2016 had reset the clock, a clever manipulation. A dangerous precedent. Protests erupted, civilians were beaten, opposition leaders were jailed or exiled, dozens died in clashes. But the vote went forward and Ouattara won again. The West, as always, offered muted responses. Stability is important, they said. Let's maintain peace, they urged. But peace for whom and at what cost? In reality, Ivory Coast was becoming a pressure cooker. Opposition parties were crippled. Security forces acted as private enforcers, journalists vanished, and the economy, though statistically strong, favored the elite, leaving the youth jobless, angry, and forgotten. For many Ivorians, their democracy had become a prison in disguise, and the man at the center refused to hand over the keys. But something was shifting. In the barracks, in the villages, even in the diaspora. Enough is enough. That whisper became a storm, and the storm was coming for Ouattara. When the people are silenced, the army listens louder. In Ivory Coast, the military has always played a double role, both sword and shield. Under Ouattara, that role grew complicated. After the post-election civil war of 2010-2011, Ouattara consolidated power not just through elections, but by restructuring the armed forces. Promotions were handed out generously to loyalists. Rival officers were retired or reshuffled. Paramilitary units were merged under presidential command. But loyalty built on fear is never permanent. Over time, cracks began to form within the ranks. Young officers, those who had watched their parents lose jobs, their brothers migrate, their neighborhoods decay, began to ask uncomfortable questions. Why are we guarding a palace while people sleep hungry? Why are French troops still on our soil? Why are we arresting students and activists instead of protecting them? The older generals, many aligned with the regime, dismissed these doubts. But the younger ranks didn't forget. They watched, they waited. Then came Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger. Each time a corrupt, foreign-backed president was removed, the message grew clearer. You can take back your country, even from a suit and tie. In 2022, a classified memo circulated within the Ivorian military warning of ideological contamination from Burkina Faso's revolutionary wave. It was meant to stop something. Instead, it sparked something in secret meetings, in border camps, on encrypted apps. The idea began to form. We can be next, not for power, not for glory, but for restoration. A new generation of soldiers had made up their minds, and they were no longer just whispering, they were planning. Coups don't begin with gunfire, they begin with silence. By early 2023, something felt different in Ivory Coast. The usual performances continued. Ribbon-cutting ceremonies, presidential speeches, foreign dignitaries shaking hands and issuing grants. But beneath the surface, unease was rising. Opposition parties were either co-opted, exiled, or irrelevant. The press was muffled, civil society exhausted. And then, the president disappeared from public view. For over a month, Ouattara made no national address. Rumors swirled. Was he ill? Was he hiding? Was he preparing to flee? His office dismissed it all as logistical adjustments. But inside the army, the silence was confirmation. Something was falling apart, and no one was steering the ship. That vacuum was exactly what the younger military officers had waited for. They knew from history, the most successful coups don't erupt. They unfold, quietly, cleanly. So while the world focused on other crises, plans were drawn in dormitories, in barracks, in outposts near Bouaké and Korhogo. It was precise. Communications towers mapped, power grids identified, presidential escape routes monitored, foreign embassy movement tracked. They studied the errors of other coups, Sudan's chaos, Guinea's backlash, Niger's isolation. This one would be different. Swift, surgical, symbolic. The key, strike before the West could intervene and present it not as military lust, but as national salvation. The code name, Operation Renaissance. And the first signal would come from within the palace itself, from a uniform long trusted, now quietly aligned with the uprising. "It's time," the message read. Just 2 words, and with that, the countdown began. History doesn't knock twice. The night had come. It began at 03:12 a.m., while most of the capital was asleep and the heartbeat of the regime was at its weakest. Military convoys moved swiftly through Abidjan, engines off, headlights dimmed. No sirens, no public warnings, no chest beating. First target, RTI, Radio Diffusion Télévision Ivoirienne, state media headquarters. The soldiers entered with surgical precision, no resistance. The security guards were loyal to the flag, not the president. A junior officer, barely 28, took the mic. "This is not a coup against the people. This is a restoration of the people." The signal was live. Second target, Presidential Guard compound. Resistance was brief, shots were fired, but the corps had already defected. By 04:30 a.m., the palace was surrounded and its gates wide open. Alassane Ouattara was not found. Sources suggest he had been secretly evacuated 2 days earlier under French security escort. His final escape from the nation he had once claimed to lead into a golden future. But there was no gold now, only reckoning. By sunrise, the Ivorian tricolor flew alone, no longer guarded by oligarchs or foreign advisors, but by soldiers wearing new patches, for the people, not for power. And just like that, a regime had ended. There was no national anthem, no tanks in the streets, no parades, just stunned silence, and the slow realization that Ivory Coast had turned a page, perhaps for the last time. At noon, a single communiqué was released. The era of imposed democracy is over. Ivory Coast belongs to its people again. Voiceover. The world watched with wide eyes, but the people watched with wider hope. In the villages, people turned their radios up. In the cities, traffic paused. In the diaspora, social media exploded. For the first time in years, the nation felt one emotion not controlled by state media. When a puppet falls, the puppeteers panic. As Ivory Coast woke to a new dawn, the international community scrambled to find its voice. The first statement came from France, measured, cautious. "We are monitoring the situation in Abidjan and call for the restoration of constitutional order." But the truth was simple. Paris was caught off guard. Ivory Coast had long been considered one of France's most reliable allies in West Africa. French troops were stationed on Ivorian soil. French companies controlled critical infrastructure, cocoa exports, and financial systems. And now, in a matter of hours, that entire influence had begun to slip through their fingers. Across the Atlantic, the United States released a similarly vague response. "We urge calm and a swift return to democratic governance." But this time, the pressure was different. After coups in Burkina Faso, Mali, Guinea, and Niger, a pattern had formed. The West's calls for democracy were being met with one question across Africa: whose democracy, yours or ours? Meanwhile, in Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Conakry, leaders wasted no time. Burkina Faso issued a statement of support. Ivory Coast has joined the March of African Dignity. Mali called it a correction of illegitimacy. Guinea offered material support for transition logistics. Even non-military states like Senegal and Ghana remained strikingly silent, unwilling to condemn what many within their own borders secretly applauded. The African Union, however, followed protocol, suspending Ivory Coast's membership. But even that announcement lacked the usual fire. They had done the same with Mali, then Niger, then Burkina Faso, and yet none had collapsed. In fact, many were stabilizing on their own terms. Perhaps this isn't instability, one political analyst in Nairobi remarked. Perhaps it's redefinition. Back in Abidjan, the people weren't waiting for validation from Europe or Washington. They were watching something more important. The soldiers weren't looting. They weren't parading. They were organizing. The coup hadn't just removed a dictator. It had sparked the possibility of something rare in post-colonial Africa, a second beginning. Toppling a regime is one battle. Building a nation is a war of patience. In the days following the coup, many expected chaos, looting, retaliation, power grabs, but what they got was order. The Military Council, now in full control, issued a national address from the state television headquarters, calm, concise, and remarkably unmilitaristic. There will be no witch hunts, no foreign trials. We are not here for revenge. We are here for restoration. They called for the formation of a civic transition committee made up of civil society leaders, religious figures, economists, retired judges, youth representatives, and yes, military observers. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. Schools reopened within 48 hours. Markets stabilized. The internet, usually shut down during coups, remained on. A rare thing in African power shifts, transparency was prioritized over control. The military also made two announcements that stunned international observers. All existing mining and resource contracts were to be audited. A commission was created to investigate who had benefited from state assets, especially foreign corporations. The French military presence would be re-evaluated. No accusations, no insults, just a calm, clear notice that Ivory Coast was reassessing all foreign partnerships. We will no longer be a forward operating base for external interests, the statement read. We are not against the West. But we are no longer for sale. That sentence resonated far beyond Abidjan. In Niamey, Ouagadougou, and Conakry, crowds took to the streets in celebration, not because of a coup in Ivory Coast, but because of what it meant for the entire region. A domino wasn't falling. A continent was standing. Back in Abidjan, murals began to appear overnight. One showed a soldier handing a child a book. Another showed a ballot box crushing a golden throne. One read simply, "No more pretend democracy." Voiceover, it was not yet a revolution, but it was the first honest breath Ivory Coast had taken in years. Even when dictators fall, their networks remain. Alassane Ouattara may have fled, but his influence had not yet vanished. The man had built a deeply entrenched web of loyalists within the business elite, the police, the judiciary, even the media. And these networks were not going to let go easily. Within days of the military takeover, former ministers began disappearing from their luxury homes. Some fled across borders, others went underground. A few were caught trying to board private jets with bags of cash and foreign passports. The transitional government responded carefully. We are not hunting individuals, we are dismantling systems. But they weren't naive. They knew power doesn't just vanish. It hides, it adapts, it strikes back when memory fades. A full investigation was launched into election tampering from 2015 to 2020, foreign wire transfers tied to infrastructure contracts, paramilitary crackdowns on civilian protests, state-controlled media, disinformation campaigns. One shocking revelation came just days into the probe. Over $1.2 billion in state funds had been laundered through shell companies based in Paris, Dubai, and Mauritius, allegedly routed through Ouattara's inner circle. Western banks denied wrongdoing, but the documents were undeniable. The people, however, didn't need proof. They had felt the corruption in their bones for years. When hospitals lack oxygen, but politicians fly private, people don't need audits. They need justice. Still, the Military Council insisted this would not be a witch hunt. They set a timeline, 6 months to draft a new transitional charter, 9 months to hold national consultations, 12 months for free, fair elections, with international observers from both Africa and the diaspora, and the most radical promise of all, no member of the current Military Council would run for office. The goal wasn't to replace suits with boots, it was to reset the foundation. Across universities, mosques, churches, and town halls, a single question echoed: If not dictatorship and not imported democracy, then what? Voiceover. Ivory Coast stood at the crossroads between history and hope, but this time it had decided to draw its own map. In one country, a coup. In a continent, a question. What comes after? The events in Ivory Coast had done more than topple a ruler. They had triggered a continental awakening. In Senegal, students organized forums titled, "Can True Democracy Exist Under Foreign Economic Control?" In Gabon, police officers quietly joined youth protests against elite corruption. In Nigeria, hashtags like "Jack's Our Turn Next" trended for days, fueled by frustration over stagnant elections, inflation, and empty promises. But it wasn't just the street movements watching Ivory Coast. African think tanks, university scholars, and constitutional lawyers were dissecting what had just occurred. Was this a coup or a necessary correction? Was it a rebellion or a reset? Could a military transition model like this, clean, planned, people-oriented, be a blueprint? One article in the Addis Ababa Review made headlines: "The West fears coups, Africa fears silence." And therein lay the truth. For decades, the West had defined stability in Africa as whatever ensured foreign access to minerals, markets, and military zones. Meanwhile, African citizens had defined stability as clean water, fair elections, schools that function, hospitals that save lives. The two definitions were no longer compatible. Back in Abidjan, that disconnect became fuel. The Transitional Council opened the first-ever national forum on civic governance, streamed live online, unfiltered. Ordinary citizens could submit questions to the leadership, and they didn't hold back. Where did the IMF money go? Why are we still using the CFA franc? Can we trade minerals with other African nations instead of shipping everything to France? The council didn't have all the answers, but for once, the people were allowed to ask. That simple act, in a country once ruled by silence, felt revolutionary. Voiceover. The dictator had fallen, but the real victory was not in the palace. It was in the streets, in the air, in the minds of a people rediscovering their voice. Power is not inherited, it is reclaimed. 1 year later, Ivory Coast held elections. Not perfect, not without tension. But for the first time in decades, they were free of foreign meddling, regime manipulation, and predetermined outcomes. The winner? A civilian candidate with no ties to the old order, an economist with roots in the people's movements, a symbol not of military takeover, but of restored civilian rule born out of sacrifice. The military quietly returned to the barracks. The Transition Council disbanded itself as promised, and across Africa, jaws dropped. This wasn't just a successful coup. It was a successful handoff of power, a revolution that didn't end in chaos, but in structure. Meanwhile, in Paris, Washington, Brussels, concerns continued to rise. Foreign contracts were renegotiated, military bases were downsized. The CFA franc was now openly challenged in public debate, and China, Turkey, and Russia scrambled to fill the space once monopolized by France and the West. But Ivory Coast didn't belong to any of them. It belonged to Ivorians again. Young artists painted murals of the fallen regime. Poets wrote verses titled, "We are no one's colony." A new anthem was proposed, one that spoke not of submission, but of dignity, unity, and renewal. And though Alassane Ouattara remained in exile, his image had faded. He was no longer feared. He was no longer relevant. He was a ghost of an old Africa, a symbol of the era where power was hoarded, not shared. That era had ended, not just in Abidjan, but across a continent waking from a long and manipulated dream. Voiceover closes. Ivory Coast's military coup was not just about one man falling. It was about a nation rising. It was about redefining power and reminding Africa and the world that sovereignty is not given, it is taken back, and this time it's here to stay. Fade to black, soundtrack, a new national rhythm rising with the people's voices, not imposed from above.